Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In the vast courtroom of the Manhattan courthouse, the air was thick with formality and tension. Large windows let in a cold light that illuminated the wood-paneled walls and polished oak benches where the public had settled to follow the proceedings. Among them, a few journalists were taking notes, curious to follow a trial they had thought would be unremarkable. At the center of the scene, standing near the judge's desk, was Marcus Hayes, a young black man of barely 24. His dark suit was simple, almost austere, and his slightly crooked tie betrayed an apparent lack of experience. He clutched a file to his chest, and every movement betrayed a surprising mixture of concentration and composure. Judge Richard Thornton, a white man in his 50s with piercing eyes and a condescending tone, watched him with a mocking smile. "Sir, are you sure you want to plead your own case?" he asked, his voice a mixture of amusement and disdain. His eyes gleamed with the arrogance of those who always believe their experience gives them every right. Marcus looked up calmly and replied, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was clear and steady, betraying a self-confidence that made the air around him ripple slightly. But Thornton remained unfazed. He was convinced that such a modest young man would stumble over his words, and he was already anticipating the satisfaction of ridiculing him before the entire court. Murmurs arose from the audience, some spectators intrigued by Marcus's quiet confidence, others skeptical. The lawyers present, accustomed to more theatrical pleadings, observed in silence, some with discreet interest, others with a defiant smile. The judge approached, leaning slightly forward, and said sarcastically, "You look ready. But do you really know what you're doing?" Marcus did not waver. He fixed his gaze on the judge and calmly replied, "Experience is not always visible. Sometimes it hides behind appearances." An icy silence fell over the courtroom. The murmurs died away. Even the judge felt a shiver of unease, which he tried to mask behind a forced smile. What he didn't know was that Marcus Hayes wasn't the naive student he'd imagined. He was a brilliant lawyer, already renowned for his work on the city's most complex cases, who had chosen to appear in this guise to test the system's biases and observe justice in its purest form. This prologue sets the scene, the atmosphere, and the central conflict, a young man underestimated by the judge, but who conceals immense talent and formidable intelligence. It prepares the reader for the imminent confrontation, with mounting tension and a twist to come. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every move of young Marcus Hayes was scrutinized, as if the slightest misstep could confirm Judge Thornton's prejudice. But Marcus, calm and focused, showed no sign of nervousness. Thornton sat up straight in his seat, crossed his arms, and said mockingly, "Very well. Mr. Hayes, so you are here to defend your client without the help of an experienced lawyer?" A soft laugh escaped his lips, a laugh that betrayed both his amusement and his contempt. The spectators exchanged intrigued glances, some offering an embarrassed smile so as not to encourage the humiliation. Marcus placed his file on the table and replied in a firm, calm voice, "Your Honor, every person deserves a clear and rigorous defense. Experience is not measured solely by age or the length of a career." Judge Thornton frowned. He hadn't expected such self-assurance. He was used to young litigants stammering or blushing under the weight of the court. But Marcus showed no sign of doubt. "Very well," Thornton said, still sarcastic. "Let's begin then. Can you explain to the court how you intend to convince them that your client is not responsible, despite the overwhelming evidence?" Marcus opened his file and took out a meticulously prepared document. "Your Honor, the evidence must be interpreted with caution. What you consider overwhelming evidence is merely superficial observation. An objective analysis of the facts reveals that my client's responsibility has not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge's assistants leaned towards one another, surprised by the clarity and precision of Marcus's remarks. Even some of the experienced lawyers present exchanged admiring glances. Thornton, irritated by his young opponent's skill, tried to trap him. "Interesting, but can you cite any legal precedents that justifies such an interpretation of the facts?" Marcus raised a slight eyebrow and replied with implacable calm. Of course, Your Honor. In the matter Harrison vs. New York, the court ruled that the appearance of the evidence was insufficient to establish guilt. Furthermore, he detailed several complex precedents, citing articles and case law with an ease that silenced the general murmur. Judge Thornton paled slightly. He had just realized that he had underestimated the young man. In the audience, attitudes began to change. He was no longer just a naive student, he was a formidable lawyer, capable of holding his own in court with rare eloquence and intelligence. Marcus, impassive, continued his plea, each word carefully chosen, each gesture measured to maintain everyone's attention. When the hearing ended for the break, Judge Thornton remained frozen, unable to hide his embarrassment. Marcus, calm, gathered his documents and left the room, leaving behind a heavy silence filled with admiration and curiosity. This first chapter establishes the main conflict, the young man mocked by the judge and his demonstration of competence and calm, which gradually changes everyone's perception in the courtroom. The courtroom resumed after the break. Judge Thornton, still shaken by Marcus's masterful performance, tried to regain his composure. He tapped on his lectern and announced, "Very well, let's continue. Mr. Hayes, I assume you have prepared other arguments to convince this court." Marcus nodded calmly. His dark eyes shone with intelligence and determination. He knew that every word, every gesture mattered. It wasn't just about defending his client, but also about demonstrating that judging by appearances could be dangerous. He stood up, placed his documents on the desk, and began. "Your Honor, if I may, the case should not be judged by the impression the evidence may leave, but by a careful analysis of the facts and their context." A hush fell over the room. The spectators, once indifferent, were now hanging on his every word. The murmurs in the audience turned into admiring whispers. Even the most seasoned lawyers were impressed by the clarity of his reasoning. Sensing that he was losing control, Thornton attempted a new trap. "And how do you explain that witnesses claim to have seen your client at the scene?" Marcus gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile and replied, "Your Honor, testimonies must be corroborated by concrete evidence. However, upon examining the police reports and available videos, obvious contradictions are evident. Witnesses are not infallible, and their perceptions can be influenced by unconscious biases." He produced a video clip that he had carefully analyzed and showed it to the court. The meticulously examined details revealed that Marcus's client had never been at the scene at the time of the incident. The murmur in the room grew louder. Even Judge Thornton felt embarrassment rising in his throat. He began to understand that Marcus was not just a novice, but a formidable opponent. "Very interesting, Mr. Hayes," stammered Thornton, trying to hide his surprise. Marcus continues, relentlessly. "Furthermore, Your Honor, documents I have obtained indicate that proper procedures were not followed, which compromises the validity of the evidence." Every word Marcus spoke shook the judge's confidence. The spectators were captivated by the precision of his words and the quiet assurance with which he delivered them. Thornton's initial mockery was now turning against him, and he knew it. When the hearing ended for the day, the eyes of the journalists and spectators were on Marcus. He bowed slightly and left the room, leaving behind a stunned judge and a deeply impressed court. In the corridor, several lawyers approached him, whispering, "Who is this young man? Incredible, he knows every detail, every precedent." Marcus, without an arrogant smile, simply replied, "Justice has no age limit, and talent isn't always visible on the outside." The next day, the courtroom was even more crowded. Word of Marcus Hayes's impressive performance had spread throughout the city and among lawyers. Journalists had turned out in droves, some hoping to witness another fiasco, others curious to see if the young man could maintain his composure and control. Judge Thornton entered the room with a tense expression. His mocking smile had vanished. He now knew that Marcus was not a mere novice and felt the weight of the gaze of all the spectators and lawyers present. Thornton tapped lightly with his hammer and said, attempting to regain his authority, "Very well, Mr. Hayes, let's continue. You seem quite confident after your demonstration yesterday." Marcus stood up, placed his file on the table, and calmly met the judge's gaze. His voice was clear, measured, and imbued with quiet confidence. "Your Honor, before we continue, I think it's only right that you know my true identity." A murmur rippled through the room. The spectators leaned forward, intrigued. Thornton frowned, suspicious. "Your true identity? What do you mean?" he asked, uncertainly. Marcus then took out a business card he had carefully kept in his inside pocket. He slowly handed it to the judge. On the card, in elegant handwriting, Marcus Hayes, lawyer specializing in criminal and civil law. Remarkable victories in several high-profile cases. Thornton paled. He took the card with a trembling hand, unable to hide his embarrassment. The room fell completely silent. The curious murmurs of the spectators turned into exclamations of admiration. "That's impossible," murmured an experienced lawyer sitting in the audience. "How could we have underestimated him like that?" added a journalist. Marcus continued, with impressive calm. "Your Honor, it is clear that you judged me on my appearance. I don't wear an expensive suit, I don't belong to a famous firm, but I know the law and I understand the system. This hearing is a reminder that competence and intelligence are not measured by age, appearance, or reputation." Judge Thornton, now red with shame, lowered his eyes. He had mocked Marcus, thinking him to be an inexperienced young student, and now he found himself publicly humiliated by this same young man. Marcus, unperturbed, gathered his documents and turned to face the audience. His gaze swept the room, and his voice resonated firmly. "Let this lesson serve everyone here, never underestimate anyone. Justice must prevail over prejudice." The courtroom erupted in applause. Even the most skeptical lawyers rose to salute Marcus's competence and courage. Thornton, humiliated but aware of his mistake, remained silent, unable to respond. This chapter marks the central turning point of the story. Marcus reveals his true identity and transforms the judge's mockery into a lesson in humility and justice, while gaining the respect of everyone present. The hearing resumed immediately after Marcus's revelation. Judge Thornton, still in shock, tried his best to regain his authority, but his words rang hollow in the face of the aura of control and calm that Marcus exuded. Marcus stepped forward, fixing his gaze on the court, each word measured, each gesture precise. "Your Honor, now that my true identity has been established, it is essential that we return to the facts of this case, without prejudice or distractions." He began to analyze the evidence point by point, exposing contradictions in the testimonies and demonstrating that certain pieces of evidence presented were inadmissible according to case law. Each argument was accompanied by precise citations of legal precedents, logical analyses, and concrete examples. The audience and the lawyers present were captivated. The murmurs of admiration turned into exclamations. "Incredible, he's right about everything. How could we have been so wrong?" Judge Thornton, aware that his initial judgment had been influenced by prejudice, felt his pride waver. He listened to Marcus with an attention he had never before given to a young litigant. Marcus didn't stop there. He addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, what you did yesterday by mocking me is understandable, because it's easy to judge someone by their appearance. But true justice lies in evaluating facts and skills, not appearances." Thornton lowered his eyes, unable to reply. He was struck by the accuracy of Marcus's words and his dignity. The spectators, for their part, were deeply impressed. The entire room seemed to hang on the words of this young man, who had transformed the initial humiliation into a lesson in wisdom and competence. At the end of the hearing, Marcus turned to the public and concluded calmly. "Let each of us remember that true merit is not measured by appearance, age, or reputation, but by knowledge, work, and integrity." Applause erupted spontaneously. Some lawyers rose to congratulate Marcus. Judge Thornton remained silent, aware that he had just received a lesson in humility that he would never forget. Outside, in the courthouse corridors, journalists crowded around Marcus, eager to learn his identity and his impressions. Marcus, ever humble, replied, "I am not seeking recognition. My only goal is for justice to be served fairly, without prejudice or favoritism." This chapter shows how Marcus transforms the initial situation, where he was ridiculed and underestimated, into a moment of justice, respect, and a moral lesson for everyone, including the judge. A few days after the hearing, Marcus Hayes's reputation had skyrocketed. Local and national media outlets reported on his masterful intervention and how he had turned around a situation in which he had been mocked and underestimated. In the courthouse corridors, fellow lawyers and judges came to shake his hand, some with admiration, others with a mixture of embarrassment and respect. Judge Thornton, for his part, had spent several nights reflecting on his prejudices and his conduct. His initial arrogance had transformed into humility. He decided to meet with Marcus privately. In his office, he simply said, "Mr. Hayes, I wish to apologize for my mockery and behavior during your first plea. I underestimated your abilities and I acknowledge my mistake." Marcus, ever calm and measured, replied, "Your Honor, I expect no apology. My goal was to demonstrate that competence and justice do not depend on appearances. You have understood this lesson, and that is what matters." Over the weeks, Marcus received offers to join several prestigious firms, all captivated by his talent and audacity. But more than professional recognition, it was the shift in attitudes around him that brought him profound satisfaction. The spectators and lawyers present at the hearing recounted the story to their colleagues, reminding everyone that judging someone by their appearance can lead to serious errors. As for Judge Thornton, the experience changed his approach to young lawyers and clients. He became more attentive, fairer, and less quick to judge. His newfound humility allowed him to listen more attentively and to truly consider each argument on its merits, rather than on his initial impression. Marcus, for his part, continued his work as a lawyer with discretion but efficiency. He knew his reputation was beyond question, and that true justice always required courage and discernment. When he thought back to the day he had been ridiculed, he smiled inwardly, satisfied to have transformed a potential humiliation into a moment of truth and lasting respect. Marcus Hayes' story remained in the court's memory as an example of competence, courage, and justice, reminding everyone that talent and integrity can be found behind the most modest appearances.